Elvis Presley died 36 years ago this week. An everlasting icon, he massively contributed to the evolution of the rock and pop culture, both in Ireland and around the globe.
In studio with us to chat about the King is one of the world's youngest Elvis biographers, Ivor Casey. Ivor, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, writing a book on Elvis is no mean feat, so I'm assuming you're a massive fan.
Yes, yeah. Well,
so where did the obsession come from?
Well, it started all back when I was 13, back in 1997, the 20th anniversary of Elvis's death. I was getting ready to go to school again, you know, coming up to September, and there was a big tribute of Elvis events all over TV, and I was just captivated by everything. I had been introduced to Elvis as a younger child through a couple of his movies, which are more suited to a younger audience, but there was concerts on that day, and I was just captivated by his magnetism as a performer.
Now, Elvis and Ireland, people will stop and say, huh, he was here and we missed him. But actually, it's more a book of, I suppose, the culture at the time and his influence on Irish people. Because we were such a society controlled by the church back then, so there must have been serious repercussions to people listening to that kind of music. What era are we talking about?
Well, in the 1950s, Elvis wasn't, well, rock and roll music wasn't played on Radio Éireann, which was the only radio channel we had in the country. People had to tune into Radio Luxembourg, and for a lot of people that was like experiencing some sort of forbidden fruit, something that was not acceptable here. And the church, there was a lot of priests, a lot of stories, and I source and I cite the people who experienced the times, who saw that some of the priests were not very in favour of rock and roll, you know, that it was the devil's music, pretty much what was going on in the south of America at the time. But a lot of Elvis films were censored here. One was banned. The film King Creole was banned in Ireland originally.
And on what basis, Ivor? What was I mean, I've seen King Creole.
Yes.
I'm trying to think what was in it.
It's harmless compared to today's.
Yeah, it was the gyrations. Some of the scenes of gyrations of Elvis were the censor wanted. Lee Mahore was the censor at the time, and he wanted 8 cuts of the film, but the studio refused those cuts, and therefore the film was banned in Ireland.
And the other thing, I mean, you mentioned obviously the devil's music and it being frowned upon by more pious people, but apparently he was actually, the subject of Elvis Presley was debated in the Dáil.
That's correct, yeah. In 1959, Elvis was brought up in Dáil debates. He was brought up a couple of times between 59 to 62, and
by his fans, presume. I presume not.
Not so much, no. There was a couple of politicians. They spoke about him irreverently, you know, as Elvis the Pelvis. They were more concerned about the amount of money that was being generated for Radio Luxembourg, people tuning away from RTE and tuning into Radio Luxembourg, and they kind of mildly criticised him, but in '62 they criticised his finances in the Dáil. They were talking about how Elvis was getting a lot more money than somebody like JFK and the Prime Minister of England.
It just doesn't, I mean, it's uncanny the way they were thinking. You think the government, rather than trying to influence the whole mass of the Irish public, would just say, OK, listen, you can play his music and that's the way we'll get our advertising revenue and people listening. So really, he was fairly despised by those in power in the 50s and 60s. Maybe they were fearful of him or something.
Well, I suppose, yeah, Elvis would, like, no one was ready for Elvis. Rock and roll music was so alien to people, especially in Ireland in the 50s.
So the other thing as well is that the influence that we're talking about, it wasn't just an influence on fans, because there was a lot of kind of people we now regard, I suppose, as industry people from the music industry that have been influenced by Elvis, and ironically vice versa too, from an Irish perspective.
Yes, well, Elvis's influence began very early on, despite the condemnation, you know, in the 50s. He still trickled in, and people, you know, Brendan Boyer is probably the best example of somebody who started off in the show bands, who wanted to imitate the American rock and roll music, and he did it very well for the show bands. And then Elvis was a very sexual, kind of raunchy performer, so the beat groups came along in the 60s. Rory Gallagher and Phil Lynott and all of those kind of stars were hugely inspired by Elvis and Bono, and to this day, like almost every major Irish act has covered an Elvis song.
But I'm also intrigued as well, though, in terms of the way it goes the other way, because you were saying Elvis, despite never having visited Ireland, was actually influenced by a lot of Irish performers, Irish tenors, for example, and things like that.
That's true, yeah. In an interview, when Elvis was in Germany, he did a 2-year stint in the army in Germany, and he was asked in an interview about opera and classical music, and his response was that he had a keen interest in Irish tenors. And later on, we know that that Elvis went on to record Danny Boy and I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen.
It's funny how he never made the trip over then, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why Elvis never made an appearance outside of America. A couple of shows in Canada, but that was it. His manager, there's a few reasons why Elvis wasn't allowed out of America to perform. One of the reasons was his manager was an illegal alien. That's the kind of more commonly accepted rumour. But then there was another rumour that Elvis, in his later years, had a keen interest in guns and the prescription drugs, which might have been a problem getting through customs. But then my feeling about that is, though, that in the 50s Elvis wasn't into any of that stuff, and Bill Haley got to tour Ireland, but Elvis never came here.
Now, getting back to the book, you have some serious fans, one of whom being Bono, and he is very happy to endorse the book. Tell us how you met him and how this whole Elvis shared fanship came about.
Yes, the Corner Note Cafe is they helped me launch my book. They're based in Dalkey, and they've been helping me launch the book over the last few months. And Bono is a good friend and a regular customer there, so they set up the meeting with me with Bono, and Bono got to read the book, and he told me that he was delighted to be part of it because there's a good section on U2 in it, and the influence Elvis has on U2. So it was a great day to meet Bono. You know, he's a really nice guy. So
nice to get the seal of approval from him.
Absolutely, and he's not the only Irish kind of musical heavyweight, because Barry Devlin from the Horselips also.
Yeah, he launched the book for me in May. Yeah, so we had a great evening that evening. And
again, would they regard themselves as Elvis fans in a specific sense, or just a general sense that all music fans obviously have an appreciation of?
Well, they certainly have a great appreciation. Bono, certainly from my research, has a very keen interest in Elvis. Elvis has actually been a very big inspiration on Bono. In the early 90s, Bono did a show where he kind of imitated the kind of costumes that Elvis wore. You know, the Fly from the Zoo TV tour is inspired by Elvis' '68 comeback special, and Bono's quite often cited as being a big fan.
Now, you have had this idea for the book in your head for 10 years, and yet it's only come into fruition in recent months. Yeah. Why so long? Why didn't you write it earlier?
Well, the idea came about in 2002. I was going for the Leaving Cert at the time, and I had no idea what I wanted to do at the time. I had a big interest in writing in English, and I had this big interest in Elvis, so I thought I'd put the two together, come up with an original idea. And at the early stages, there was interest from publishers, but their big concern was that I didn't have any photographs of Elvis, and they wanted me to provide photographs, but that was quite a difficult feat for somebody in my position to be able to do.
And so young.
Yeah, that was the other thing too. And so I got the usual rejections that most writers get, and one agent even said the work was too academic, which I found peculiar, because
backhanded compliment.
Yeah, so that's very much so. Yeah, but it's accessible to everybody.
But you self-published it, but
it is there.
It's
on the shelves now, which is the good news.
That's the good news. Yeah, I self-published it there earlier in the year, and it's in Eason's.
Excellent. Well, listen, the very best of luck with it, Ivor. Thanks a million for coming in to talk to us about it.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure it's going to be a huge success. Elvis in Ireland.